Hi everyone, my name is Tori, this is Novel Life, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have some historical fiction recommendations to share with you. So I'm a huge lover of historical fiction, and it is one of my goals for 2024 to read more historical fiction books. I am someone who I love that we can read about a time period, where we have these super small things that happen that don't always get written in history books or we don't always learn about in school. So I can kind of just learn about this time and this place and this one piece of history that's happened while also enjoying this really amazing fiction book that these authors have created. So I definitely have some of my tried and true historical fiction authors, but some of the books I'm going to talk about are books by not as well known historical fiction authors, and I'm very excited because some of these are my all-time favorites. And I can't wait to read more from these authors in 2024. So this is a collab with Christy from Christy Reads a Lot. We decided to give you some historical fiction recommendations. So I will have her channel and her video linked in the description box below. If you don't follow Christy already, you definitely need to. She is so freaking sweet, and she just started a booktube channel, I think last year. She's killing it. She posts so consistent. She reads so much, so she has so many books to talk about. But anyway, she's the best. Go give her a follow if you don't follow already. Go check out her video for some more historical fiction recommendations. But let's just go ahead and get into mine. The first one I have is actually one that I mentioned, I think in an end of year TBR, end of the year tag. Forgot what it was, but that is A Lovely War by Julie Berry. And I forgot I even mentioned it in the video until someone messaged me on Instagram. They were like, hey, you talked about this book. It had a really interesting premise. Can you let me know what it is? And I was like, wait, what? And she's like, oh, I went back and found it. It's Lovely War. This was one of my favorite books of 2020. I remember sobbing my eyes out reading this book. I don't know what it was. I don't know. Just the all-encompassing merging of the different stories really got me. I've even tabbed it. This was before I even had official tabs. Do you see how huge these tabs are? These are sticky note tabs. They're huge. And this is before I annotated anything, but I definitely wanted to put some of my favorite quotes, point out some of my favorite quotes and favorite parts. So in this book, you follow these two different stories being told by the Greek gods. So it's very interesting that you have Aphrodite and a Hephaestus, which if you know their story, you know that they're kind of arranged. Aphrodite's the goddess of beauty and, all of that stuff. And Hephaestus is known to be a very ugly god, I guess you could say. And it's just interesting. They're the ones telling the story, as well as some other gods that come into the picture. So you get technically three stories. What's happening with the gods, which I thought was so interesting, but also you're getting these two stories of these two couples that you're following during, I think, World War I, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of things that's talked about in this book. This is a huge book. Oh my God, I really want to reread this book. I might reread it this year. I don't know. But I loved this book when I picked it up. I just fell in love with the writing. And I will say for historical fiction, because I'm a lover of romance, I will always be a romance girly. A lot of the historical fiction books that I read typically has a romance, most of the time with an HEA. And if it doesn't have an HEA, it makes sense of why there's no HEA. And I'm not mad about it, if you know what I mean. But don't ever go into a historical fiction book thinking that you're going to get an HEA, because sometimes it's not always guaranteed. But I loved this book. It really dove into war and how it really affected different people and what they go through. So you have some characters that have PTSD. One of the couples is an interracial couple, so you see what he's dealing with, being a Black man in the military, especially during World War II. It is atrocious, the things that happen. And it's just such a raw and important piece of history that some people can shy away and not want to tell that story. But for me, I feel it's important to give those voices a platform to show what actually happened, because I didn't learn about this in World War I, what was talked about in here. So there's just a lot that I wish we learned, but that's why I like reading historical fiction. But this is one of my favorites. Highly suggest checking it out. I mean, I do love the pink cover, obviously. It's the reason why I picked it up before I read it, but I would definitely check out this one. The next book I have to talk about is The Flight Girls by Noelle Salazar. So I think I read this in 2021, and I picked this up on a limb. I think this is her debut book, if I'm not mistaken, but this takes place during World War II, and it actually talks about the female pilots during World War II. So you first see our characters. It opens up one of our female characters. She's actually at Pearl Harbor. That's where she's stationed. and that's where she's staying. And you see the bombing of Pearl Harbor happen from her eyes and the devastation of the military base that was there. And you see how kind of like she steps up and is like, I'm going to be a female pilot. Like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to like take that step. This is like what I'm going to do. And it tells that little tiny piece of history of these super strong women that want to go out and fight and do their own thing. And the only thing that they could do was be pilots. I think the program was called something. It's a acronym that I can never remember. WASP program. So Women Air Force Services Pilots Program. So yeah, it's like the program where women can like learn to be pilots and stuff. But she also forms this really interesting bond with the other women in the program, which a lot of the books that I read with historical fiction has a romance, or it has this really, really tight friendship connection between the women that our story is following. I love like women empowering historical fiction books as well. So I love it when the female character is like in the main focus of the story. And if she has a romance with someone, that's great too. But I highly suggest this one. I love The Flight Girls. I have Angels of Resistance on my TBR. I actually have the audiobook out from my library. So I do hope to get to that book because I love Noelle Salazar's writing. Like, I love the way that she writes historical fiction, and it just makes it so easy to read, but it's very addicting. So she's one of my favorite historical fiction authors. The next two I want to talk about are actually from the same author. So Amy Harmon, she writes a lot of different things. She writes some romance, but she also writes some historical fiction books. So What the Wind Knows was one of my first books by Amy Harmon. And when I tell you, if you want an HEA, this book has it. But literally, you have to read to the very last page. I'm not joking. This book scarred me. This was the first time I read a historical fiction book where I didn't think there was going to be an HEA, but I promise you there is one. So this has a little bit of a fantastical element, kind of where you kind of go, where our female character kind of goes back in time. So you see that she is out on this lake. She goes to Ireland. I'm pretty sure it's Ireland. It's been a while since I read this book, but I remember details of it. But she goes back to Ireland 1920s during the Irish Revolution, which is something that I don't think I've read a lot of historical fiction books. A lot of these time periods that I read from, or a specific part like the WASP program and the Flight Girls, literally never even heard that until I read that book. But Irish Revolution, 1920s, it was very brutal. There was a lot of things happening during the 1920s in Ireland. So it was really cool to get a glimpse into what the life was actually on the ground. So our female character, she basically goes back in time. She goes to her grandfather's funeral in now time, I should say, but she is transported back in time, and she is very, how does I say this? She looks like our main male character's person that he loved previously, I guess you could say, and the father of his child. So it's kind of like he's a single dad and stuff like that. So you see that she's like kind of gathering her feet and getting her stuff together during this time because she's also trying to come to terms that she actually did go back in time. So it's very interesting. There's this little magical aspect that Amy Harmon writes. I don't want to say too much because a lot of it is, there's a lot of twists and turns that I didn't see coming, but I personally really enjoyed this. And I will say it's more heavy on the personal connection between her and the time traveling, but the historical aspect of the Irish Revolution is there. But it's just like, halfway with the story of our female character and our main male character. So highly recommend Amy Harmon because along with What the Wind Knows, which is one of my favorites, From Sand and Ash. This one is a story of a priest and his childhood best friend and how she is Jewish and he is a Catholic priest. And what war was it? Italy, 1943. So it's during World War II, where Nazis take over Italy. And he basically hides her and he makes sure that nothing happens to her because she is Jewish and her family doesn't get round up. It is so heartbreaking, this book. He's also an amputee. So he previously lost his leg when he was a child. And you see kind of the glimpse of that. But that's the reason why he becomes a priest and why he takes this vow of celibacy. So with this book, there's a lot of, I would say, suspenseful aspects because given the nature that they are in Italy in the 1940s when it's being occupied by Nazis. And there's just a lot that goes into it that our female character goes through. And you are on this journey because you're also on this journey of this like forbiddenness, like torture that our main male character, who was taken a vow of celibacy to be a priest and like to serve the church, is now put into this place where he's starting to feel certain things. And he's like, he's talking to other priests and like what he should do and, kind of like confiding in them and stuff like that. So it is a very cool how Amy Harmon blended that type of thing during 1940s occupied Italy by the Nazis. So highly suggest checking this one out. I love Amy Harmon's writing. Like, I've read a couple more of her books, and these two are just two of my absolute favorites. The next book I have to talk about is The Last Train to Key West by Chanel Clayton. So Chanel Clayton was an author I found. I think this was the first book. I've read a couple of books by her. I have a couple on my shelf. But I was like, which one do I really want to recommend? So I really love this one because we follow two timelines of two female characters who are going through similar things. So I love Chanel Clayton. I think she is a Cuban American. If I'm not mistaken, she is Cuban American. So what I love about Chanel Clayton's writing is that she is Hispanic and she writes about different kind of Hispanic countries and historic Hispanic time periods. During this, you're following one of our female characters. Her family is in 1933 during the Cuban Revolution. And you follow our other female character after the Wall Street crash and how she travels to where all of these veterans are staying after the war. So this one was heartbreaking to me because it dealt with a lot of like military veterans that are just like, they fought in this war and now they're damaged. They have PTSD physically. They have a lot of injuries emotionally and mentally, they do as well. And so this last train to Key West is actually like during a hurricane, this hurricane's coming, and there's this one last train that's going to take everyone out of Key West, which if you know Key West, it's like the Florida Keys in between like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the United States. So like Florida. So it's kind of like a midway point for some ships and stuff like that. So it was very like, had me on the edge of my seat. And the way that she flashed back to the Cuban Revolution, the 1930s, and then, the time period of when after Wall Street crashed, she balances it really, really well. And for someone who doesn't always like flashbacks, I think this dual timeline really worked for me. And I think she does this in a couple other of her books, and it just works for me, and I really liked it. So if you want to start with Chanel Clayton, definitely check this one out. And the last book I want to talk about is Between Shades of Grey by Rita Sepetys. I've heard her last name said a couple of different ways, but I say Sepetys. Some people say Sepetys. I'm not sure the right way, but I sobbed during this book. Sobbed. So we all know the term gulag, right? Like where men in, Soviet occupied countries were put into what they call like the jail, and they had the gulag and all this stuff. They had to like fight for their survival during I think it was World War I, if I'm not mistaken. And this book tells the story of a tiny country called Lithuania and how she and her family are being transported. I say her, she's like in her teens. She's like 16 years old. I think she has her brother with her and she has her mother. And they are transported to Siberia. So it's her journey on these cars. It's like, think of like Germany and what happened with Nazis, but like this is never talked about. It was so heartbreaking to read how they just were taken from their homes because, they had this, what they call like the secret police, where Russia was like invading these countries. And if you ever spoke out against I say Russia, but Soviet Union, if you ever spoke out against the Soviet Union, then you were kind of like taken from your home, put on these trains, and you were like sent to Siberia to where like you're not allowed to talk about anything or go against the Soviet Union. And it was so heartbreaking because her father, I think he was a librarian. He worked in like a college. And so, I mean, you can see how hard like that you toe the line. So not only did they take like him away, they also took his family and anyone who's interacted with them. And my husband is a big history person. And I asked him, I'm like, this really happened. He's like, yeah, but we never learn about it in history because it's such a small part. People don't think it's important. I'm like, do you know how many people were involved in this? So many people. It wasn't just people in the Soviet Union. It was like other countries in between Soviet Union and Europe. So I don't know. This really shook me. This was another like first historical fiction book I read that really shook me to my core. And I love Rita Sepetys. I did know that I think it was Salt to Sea by Rita Sepetys. I think it was this book. I have a couple other books on my shelf by her that I haven't read yet, but Rachel from Rachel Reads and Sings talked about, I think it was Salt to Sea, and how she said it was one of her favorite books of last year. So I definitely have some of these on my TBR. I think I'm going to do a historical fiction TBR for my Patreon, so you can always join my Patreon. I do really fun videos like that over there where I talk about books that I want to read, just random videos that I think of, but I think I'm going to do that. But more of Rita Sepetys is going to be on my TBR because I loved Between Shades of Grey. But those are all the historical fiction recommendations I have to share with you. Once again, make sure you check out Christy's video. I'll have her channel and the video linked in the description box below. For the emoji, drop me a train emoji. Yeah, drop me a train emoji because all of these take place when there's like a lot of trains. I don't know. That's what I thought. That's what I thought of. That's what we're going with. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe for more content for me. As always, I hope you're living a novel life, and I will see you in my next one. Bye, guys.